Hi, I'm Chelsea,
I'm Dave.
and we're both product designers at Stripe. You probably already know some of the things designers at Stripe do. We make the landing pages you see on stripe.com. We work on a quarterly magazine for developers called Increment.
But product design, our area of focus, is a whole different category. We work on checkout, Express for ID verification and onboarding, and of course, our dashboard, where millions of users every month log in to view and manage their business.
The payment space is naturally complex. With every regulation or alternative payment that comes on the scene, this complexity grows and grows. Design at Stripe exists to help soak up this ever-expanding complexity.
You could say that we're like shock absorbers for complexity.
You just did. The intersection of finance and technology can be pretty rocky terrain, so it's our job to make sure businesses on Stripe have the smoothest ride possible. In fact, it's right there in the titles of our roles, user experience design. And we think about things in that order. We start with users, we look at their experiences, and then we design. And those experiences aren't always good ones.
But those thorny, hidden problems are the best opportunities for us to change things for the better. We love uncovering problems. During this talk, Chelsea and I are going to talk about a couple of problems that we uncovered and share some techniques for how we did it so that you can do the same. This first story we're going to talk about is about a seemingly small problem that, if fixed, could have outsized impact. For starters, one of the trickier parts of UX design is that it can be much tougher to tell when a design is broken, say, compared to code. When code is broken, it can be pretty obvious. But a broken design, it's not going to throw error messages or show up in a log file. So a great way for us to find out a little bit more about these non-obvious problems is to spend time talking with our users. At Stripe, we do this thing called dashboard drop-ins. So every now and then, we'll email a handful of users and ask them if we can hang out with them for an hour or so. And then we watch them use dashboard. It's pretty simple. We love doing these sessions because when we watch people work, we always learn about problems that they're having and, hopefully, ways that we can improve dashboard. If you're not already doing something like this, you should definitely give it a try. If it sounds complicated, it isn't. Basically, we just cold email users right out of our database, and we ask them if they want to spend some time with us. For this, you don't need a formal research team. You can just cold email these users, and then in exchange for their time, we usually give them an Amazon gift card. And I will tell you, you will be surprised at what people will share with you for an Amazon gift card. So not long ago, we did a series of these drop-ins, and we noticed that a lot of users started doing any kind of work inside Dashboard by searching, specifically searching for customer email addresses. Whether it's issuing a refund, adjusting a subscription, checking up on a charge, all of this started with a search for a customer. We also watched these users struggle. They were trying to find a customer, but instead, we would send them to a search results page. Users would copy an email address, paste it into the search field, hit return, and then we would direct them to a search results page where they could then, finally, click on the customer that they were looking for. It was taking our users much longer than it should have for them to find the customer that they actually wanted. So it didn't take super long before we started to get pretty obsessed with this. When we got back to the office after this series of drop-ins, we checked our search metrics to see if they matched what we'd observed in the field. And it turns out they did. Dashboard users search for email addresses 5 times more than they search for anything else. Imagine for a minute that we could shave 3 seconds off of this search workflow by skipping the search results page for our users. Now, let's use a nice round number, 500,000 searches a day, 3 seconds apiece. For you math folks out there, we're talking about 17 days of saved time if we could just shave 3 seconds off of this problem. Think about for a minute how many 3-second problems you might have in your own businesses. So sure, this search that we had now technically worked, but we saw users encounter a lot of unnecessary friction, and we knew that we could make it better. So how would we remove this friction? What we needed to do was focus on the most important task that our users needed to do. You can do this too. When you're making product and design decisions, always ask yourself the question, what is the most important task this user has to do? It sounds really simple, but it's an effective and very user-centered way to help prioritize any of the actions that we need to put on screen. So in our case, the most important thing that our users were trying to do was get to a customer, not a search results page. So to fix this, what we did was redesign the search results page to make them way more compact. We got rid of any information we thought wasn't completely necessary. And then, with these more compact results, we could put the best result at the top. So instead of taking somebody by default to a show all results page, when they hit return, they could go directly to a customer. We also decided to present these search suggestions in a modal on top of the rest of dashboard to help our users focus on the choices that we were presenting to them. They could pick what they wanted here and go directly to the object that they wanted, skipping the results page. They could even open up this search modal with a keyboard command so they didn't even have to touch their mouse when they were in the middle of this process. Talk about fast. All right, so once we built something, we reached out to a handful of users to get feedback on what we made. We do this a lot. We watch them use it, usually over a remote Zoom conference. Users basically told us that they really liked this new compact design, good, and they could find what they needed, even better. But they gave us a couple of suggestions to tell us how to make it better. The first one was we needed to introduce statuses to many of these objects. So we added those. And then after that, they said, it'd be really helpful. In the old version, you used to have dates. Can you bring the dates back? No problem. So we added both of those things and started to feel pretty good about getting this thing launched. So for us, that meant we were going to roll it out to 10% of our user base. Probably pretty common. Maybe many of you do this. It's worth pointing out here, you may have seen it if you spent any time in Dashboard, but we have a little box inside Dashboard where users can send feedback directly to our teams. Maybe you didn't know what happens to it before, but now you know. All of the feedback that you type into this box, people put in suggestions, problems, bugs, feature requests, occasionally a compliment or two, into this box, and it goes straight into a Slack channel that our teams get to see, and we read it in real time. So based on the feedback we thought we might collect in this little box, we were getting really excited to turn on this new search. So we got ready. We rolled it out to 10% of our audience. Do you want to know what they said in the little box? They said it was the single best piece of design that Stripe had ever shipped. Just kidding. They hated it. They absolutely hated it. Here's some greatest hits of what we collected in terms of feedback. Change the search back. This is an inefficient and needless change. The new pop-up search is annoying and frustrating, and it doesn't work instinctively, and it needs to be reverted. Bonus points for using reverted here. This is the one that kills me the most. It has slowed down every aspect of the way I search. This is precisely the outcome we were trying to fix. Needless to say, we were devastated by this. So we had to reach out to these users to figure out how we went so far off course. We learned two big things. Speed and disorientation were the culprits. Let's dig into those. The first one was users were frustrated waiting for the results to show up after they typed in the box. What we had created was not performant enough. As a general rule, users will think that any sort of software responds instantly if you can keep the latency down to 1/10 of a second or less. Our median latency for being able to produce results in this box was almost 1 second, or 10 times longer than what feels instant. So users were sitting here waiting for the search results to show up, and they felt trapped. The second thing we learned is that users were really confused by this modal. So we had sprung onto them an unfamiliar pattern that they didn't expect. And the confusion of this new pattern outweighed any of the potential benefits we thought it might bring. So here's the thing. Human beings are wonderful, wonderful pattern matchers. We're really good at immediately understanding things that we've seen before, but sometimes we struggle when we see something we haven't seen before, especially if we're used to something else. Nest did a wonderful job of using a familiar pattern in their design of the original Nest thermostat. People would immediately know how to adjust this thermostat, even if they've never touched one before, and even if the technology inside it was way more complicated than its older predecessor. Does this mean that we can never introduce new patterns? Of course not. But we need to remember that nothing is intuitive until it is familiar. Remember this tiny iPhone? So much smaller than the one we saw today. Apple understood this idea really, really well when they released the very first iPhone way back in 2007. You might remember that Steve Jobs demoed this barely working phone in January of 2007, but the phone wasn't released until 6 months later. Apple spent that entire 6-month period of time flooding the market with commercials showing how the iPhone worked. So you had, to many of us, this was a really, really, really unfamiliar pattern because we probably hadn't ever touched a multi-touch, capacitive touch display before, let alone held one in our hands. So they showed us all these commercials of people flicking through lists and typing on a non-physical keyboard and pinching and zooming on photos so that 6 months later, once we finally had the phone in our hand, it finally felt intuitive because we were very familiar with it, even without touching it. This was very smart. All right, so back to us in our search. We adjusted our search to use a more familiar pattern going forward. So we went from this to this. Generally the same idea, but we were able to attach it in a more familiar way. We turned on this search for our users, and what did they say this time? Not so much, which is actually a really good thing. The good news for us is that we made it easier for people to find exactly what they needed in search and increased the click-through rates on objects from this window by 42%, which translates into lots and lots of 3-second saves. Besides being an incredibly humbling story, we like telling this one because it has a lot of great examples in it of how we do our design work. The first one is just talking to users to uncover hidden problems. We might not have ever noticed this pattern before without sitting down and observing users do this, not things we would have necessarily found from logs. The other thing it tells us is that reminding us how we have to adjust the design sometimes to account for the most important task. Our original search didn't do that, and our revised search did. And then the last thing is this idea of using familiar patterns. Whenever you have a choice about patterns to use, try to use the more familiar one first. And then you might save yourself a little heartache down the road. Most importantly, though, we had to pay attention to users and their problems throughout the entire course of this project so that we could not only design the solution, the right solution, but also design the solution right.
As Dave's story about search taught us, uncovering the right problems is a foundational part of designing the right solution. And designers actually have a really long history of reframing problems to find the right solutions. This is a system map for BART, the Bay Area's main railway system. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. So modern-day transit maps are a great example of how refocusing on the right problems can unlock the right solution, because transit maps didn't always look like this. This is a map of the London Underground in 1908. The lines are all pretty curvy and chaotic, and the stations near the city center, the most often used stations, are actually really crowded together and difficult to read. This is because, at the time, transit maps were made to be geographically accurate. A map is supposed to accurately describe a landscape, right? As the tube extended to reach farther and farther outside of the city, transit maps became harder and harder to read. They just couldn't fit all the extensions without making the central, densest part of the maps really small. So in 1931, a technical draftsman, or a designer for technical diagrams named Henry Beck, did a major redesign of the tube map. And it looked pretty different. Straight lines, no extraneous roads, and not at all geographically accurate. He realized that because the London Underground was under the ground, the geographic accuracy of the map actually didn't matter. What mattered most was that the people using the map could understand how to get from one station to another. Initially a side project, the map was very popular with customers. His diagrammatic approach is still the basis for today's London Tube map and has inspired most transit maps you see today. He was able to design a map that solved a huge problem for people because he knew that people weren't using transit maps to measure distance, they were using these maps to get to destinations. So in 2017, I joined the subscriptions team at Stripe. We wanted to evolve Stripe subscriptions into an end-to-end set of tools to support growing businesses and to help our users get to their destinations. We did a roadshow of sorts, traveling around to talk to users about what their biggest pain points were and where Stripe was falling short for them. And a common theme emerged pretty quickly: invoicing. And today, invoicing is a very integral part of Stripe billing. You can generate invoices from the dashboard, you can send invoice PDFs to your customers, and you can generate hosted pages to collect payment. But at the time, you couldn't do any of this with Stripe subscriptions. Invoices as a concept was very tightly coupled with subscriptions. And to send a non-recurring invoice, you had to navigate to the bottom of a customer page, create some pending invoice items, and wait for those invoices to be billed on the next subscription cycle. Or you could hit Invoice Now to cut the subscription early, and it would automatically charge the card on file. So many of our users didn't even know you can send an invoice this way. The experience wasn't discoverable, and it didn't really fit the invoicing flow most of our customers were familiar with. So, all right, we have a problem to solve, right? Invoices are not discoverable. Let's dive in and just start designing a solution. Well, hold on a second. Is this really a user problem? Sure, it's probably true, and sure, it's probably a problem, but it's really missing a critical piece of information: the user. At Stripe, our highest held operating principle is users first. To us, this means always working backwards from the problems real people using our products talk to us about, because people are the ones doing the work, creating businesses, buying services, and managing invoices. Invoices are just the tool. So being a designer at Stripe means being diligent about identifying and solving problems for real people. So if you find yourself looking at a problem statement like this without any reference to real people, I encourage you to dig deeper. Remember, the goal of any user experience design is to solve problems for real users. You might be onto something, but you need to talk to your users to make sure you're focusing on the right problem and then craft your problem statements around what they tell you. So, we had the seed of a problem, but we needed help from our users to better define and confirm that we were designing the right thing. When we started this project, we didn't have a fleshed out user research team or really established practices for doing user research. We did what Stripe had always done. We reached out to our users and we listened to their problems. One user we talked to, an accountant at a large SaaS company, used more than 4 different tools to send, pay, and reconcile invoices. To follow up on unpaid invoices, she manually emailed every user to notify them of any failed or missed payments. This toilsome, multi-tool invoicing flow was a common thread we were hearing when we were talking to our users. And this particular example represented just one person's experience sending invoices. More often than not, there were multiple people, even multiple teams, working to generate, send, and follow up on invoices. Now, journey mapping is a wonderful tool for understanding problem spaces. After talking to a large number of our users, we decided to try to map out the end-to-end life cycle of invoices to better understand this problem space. And the first version looked kind of like this. An invoice gets sent, someone receives it, someone pays it, and success. Or for a variety of reasons, it doesn't get paid and it becomes past due. It looks really simple, right? And it doesn't quite match the complex and toilsome workflows that our users were telling us about. So what are we missing? Something you might notice about this flow is that it focuses on the invoice. The invoice gets sent, received, and paid, the object. But the invoice is just the tool for people. So let's try to work people into this flow. In this case, the business sends the invoice, the customer receives it, and the customer pays. Again, success. In this version of the flow, we're starting to get a better sense of the people we need to consider and design for. We have a business, and we have a customer. But I'm sure most of you know this still doesn't quite capture all the complexities of handling invoicing at a growing company. We're definitely missing something big. So here we say the business sends the invoice. Who is the business? Remember, this flow is supposed to be people-focused. Is a business a person? Sometimes. But when we say business, what do we really mean? Businesses, more often than not, are groups of people. In our conversations with users, it was clear that sending, getting, and getting invoices paid involved many types of people within many types of businesses. Users was too generic to meaningfully design a solution for. Businesses was also too generic. We realized to truly understand the problems that needed solving, we needed to define and learn about the ecosystem of people that came together to get invoices sent, paid, and reconciled. So let's try this again. Within the businesses we interviewed, there were engineers and designers building tooling to track and send invoices, salespeople negotiating deals with customers, customer service agents sending and following up on invoices, and accounting and finance teams taking off-platform payments like checks and ACH transfers and reconciling that revenue. So we started building this version of the user journey by defining the people that we were designing for. So now that we know where the journey begins, where does it lead? It leads to a set of outcomes. At the end of the journey, we placed all the possible outcomes, both positive and negative. Some of you might be asking, why are we designing for a negative outcome? Isn't that something that we'd rather avoid? It's a very common pitfall to focus only on happy paths and totally ignore unhappy paths. But the negative outcomes are probably where your users need you the most. In an ideal world, all invoices would be paid in full and on time, right? But we all know that that's not the reality. In invoicing, we implemented features like smart retries, invoice email reminders, and hosted payment pages to give our users the tools to avoid unpaid invoices. So by acknowledging the existence of these negative outcomes, we could design strategies for avoiding unhappy paths and give our users tools to mitigate risks when they ultimately face them. Now that we know who we're designing for, and we know where they're going, we can map all the ways we know the people on the left get to the outcomes on the right. This was the journey map we generated during our invoicing work in 2017. As you can tell, it's fairly complex. It's not the prettiest diagram I've ever designed, but it told us something really important. There wasn't just one problem to solve. Many of us had worked with invoices, and some of us had even worked at companies with invoicing products. But by the end of this exercise, we had all learned something new about invoices and about our users. So even if you think you deeply understand the problem space, I encourage you to take the time to collectively study the space with your team. Talk to your users, create journey maps, build collective knowledge through brainstorms and workshops. You'll probably learn something new, something important. By designing a shared vision of what we were building, we could focus on the right problems for our users. This process exposed where we were falling short and showed us a better future that we could build for them. Comprehensive user journeys show us the paths different people take to get things done, to get to new outcomes and new destinations. By using journey maps to understand the experiences of all our users involved in invoicing, we were able to define and design an end-to-end, multifaceted invoicing product that continues to evolve today. Like the transit maps that Henry Beck designed, user journeys show us the entire system so we can better understand the problems our users are facing. They show us the paths different people take to get to where they're going, to new destinations. A well-designed transit system can transform communities by connecting people to new destinations and new opportunities. And a well-designed user journey can transform a user experience by connecting people to new outcomes. So during the weeks leading up to this talk, Dave and I spent hours discussing and debating how we could possibly fulfill the promise of this talk to teach you to think like a designer.
And while we were reflecting on our work, we realized that the advice we wanted to give is really quite simple. We want to solve problems for real people. We want to talk to them early. We want to talk to them often. We want to talk to them however we can.
While we were working on invoicing, it was surprisingly easy to fall into the trap of mistaking a business for a person or designing for an invoice rather than the people who use invoices. You can't interview a business, and you can't ask an invoice how it feels if its needs aren't being met. So challenge yourselves to really identify the people that you're designing for. How do they feel? What problems are they facing? What journeys are they on to overcome those problems? What are some of the negative outcomes you can help them overcome? And what can they achieve because your product is designed for them?
And one of the best ways to solve problems for real people is to get out there and talk to them. During our work on search, talking to users early ensured that we were solving problems for real people. By talking to them early, we identified the most impactful problems to solve. And by talking to them often, even after we were fairly confident we designed the right thing, we were able to course correct when we realized that we'd actually created new problems for our users. All companies, all products, big and small, benefit from talking to the people that you're designing for.
And you don't need a big research team to connect with the people who use your products. You can reach out to them via email or video call, invite people to your office for snacks and feedback, or create public Slack communities with your users. You could even implement your own version of our Get Feedback input box. You can show them early ideas while they're still rough, and you'll always almost uncover something surprising.
And if you have a research team, maybe it's time to reach out to them and proactively check up on what your users need so they can get a fresh baseline understanding of your users' problems. So, Chelsea, how do you think like a designer?
Solve problems for real people.
Talk to them early, talk to them often, talk to them however you can.
Thanks.
Thanks.